Okay, we're reading chapter 8 because your teacher has to see who wins the horse race. And then there's probably going to be some other cliffhanger, like she's going to get hurt during the race. Then we're going to have to read chapter 9. And it's getting darker and darker and later. And we're going to have to stay up all night and finish the whole thing. A long time ago, I was reading this book that was about World War II. And they made a movie out of the book, but I think the book was a lot better than the movie. Anyway, this story is about a young man who ends up going to war, and he enters World War II, and he's in the middle of this battle, and it's part of a battle where British troops were stuck on a beach and the Germans were just bombing them. And so they're stuck on the beach and they were waiting. It's a really famous battle called Dunkirk. And fishermen brought their boats from England and helped these soldiers to evacuate before the German soldiers. They helped the British soldiers to evacuate before the German soldiers killed all of them because they were stuck on this beach. So they brought little tiny fishing boats, hundreds and hundreds of fishing boats, and evacuated the soldiers boat by boat, soldier by soldier. It's kind of a famous story in British history. So anyhow, this book, Atonement, was about the main character was at Dunkirk, and it kind of describes everything that was happening with Dunkirk. There are German planes flying and strafing soldiers. It's so interesting, and you just kept worrying about the character. His name was Robbie, and it's like, oh, is Robbie gonna die? And I remember staying up all night. I read it all night. At about 4 a.m, I was like, Robbie's safe now, but I feel like I have to keep reading. So anyhow, sometimes that happens with books. Like, you just can't put them down. I think that's one of the few books where I've actually have not gone to sleep because I love sleeping, and I actually preferred reading over sleep. It was such a page turner. All right, I'll quit blabbing. This is chapter 8. When we entered the chaparral, I slowed Sixto to a pasotrote. Pasotrot. The best gate. I don't know how to say that. It's Pasotrote. Maybe people who know about horses know that. The best gate for threading your way through the dense thicket of manzanita, ribbonwood, and mountain mahogany. When I came near to the last of the chaparral, I used spurs on the gelding, and he responded, raising his head and snorting. Tiburon would have spied the coyote hole. He would have shied away from it and reared on his hind legs, as he sometimes did when he saw a tumbleweed coming towards him, or when he came suddenly upon a coiled rattlesnake. Sixto did not see the hole. Nor did I. I was glancing back at that instant to see where the other riders were. Sixto went into the hole with his left forefoot and lurched sideways and came to a halt. I went over his head, and the next thing I knew I was lying in a thorny tangle. Much of my breath had been knocked out of me, but somehow I managed to get on my feet. The gelding stared around wild-eyed. He had a notion to bolt, leaving me there shoulder-deep in chaparral, but I went toward him slowly and called his name softly. Fortunately, he was not hurt. At the last moment, as the gelding was about to change his mind and bolt, I grabbed for the reins and caught them. I sidled over to a mesquite bush, got one foot in a stirrup, and swung up. I flicked Sixto with the Spanish spurs, which had wheels bigger than my hand, and he went out, crashing through the last of the chaparral and onto the open mesa. I glanced back at the other riders, hoping that none of them had seen me fall. They were just coming into view. I flicked Sixto again, this time with both spurs, and gave him all his head. I raised myself a little in the saddle and leaned low and far out over the gelding's neck. I could hear hoofs behind me now. I held my breath. We were better than halfway across the mesa when I glanced over my shoulder and caught a glimpse of a silver-studded jacket and a flash of red pantaloons. Far off in front of me, I saw a crowd in front of the big gate. Then I heard the sound of cheering. The thud of hoofs was now close upon me. It could be no one except Don Roberto. In spite of his fat little hands, he was a fine rider. In spite of his fat little hands, he was a fine rider. How he would love to beat me. I still wondered if he had seen me tossed into the chaparral. It would be a shame to lose the race because of this mischance. A good horseman would never let his horse blunder into a coyote's hole. The cheering grew louder. I could see my father now, at least the broad sombrero with the silver spangles on it. I thought I felt the hot breath of Don Roberto's horse. This could not be. It must be my own breath that I felt. Then I no longer heard the thud of hoofs. I glanced back, but Don Roberto was still there, not gaining on me, but not losing either. His horse came on steadily, closer, then even with my gelding's flank. I could have reached back and touched his nose. I could have given his horse a backhanded slap with my braided quirt, but I held the quirt in the hand the burro clam had injured. "Hola!" shouted Don Roberto. The shout seemed to sound in my ear, but I still was in the lead by half a length. The hitching rack was near. It was hidden by the guests, who were waving their hats and handkerchiefs. The race would not be decided until the horses were tied to the hitching rack. This meant that I must ride as close as I could to the rack and lead the horse the rest of the way. If I were riding Tiburon, this part would be easy. The crowd began to scatter, leaving the space in front of the rack empty. Don Roberto's horse came up even with me. Don Roberto shouted words that I couldn't catch, but it was a taunt of some kind. I made a tight half circle and pulled up when I was still a dozen paces from the hitching rack. My gelding's hoofs slid on the loose earth, and a small cloud of dust flew up and blinded me for a moment. I held the reins in my good hand and turned the gelding toward the rack. Don Roberto had ridden a few steps past me. He brought his horse up stiff-legged and was on the ground at once. There was a din of voices, but I made out my father's voice shouting, "Andre, Andre!" at me. Don Roberto would have won the race if his gelding had not reared as he jumped to the ground. I reached the hitching rack and tied the reins in a hard knot before he could quiet his horse. He smiled and held out his hand. I was surprised at what a nice smile he had. I had not noticed it before. Oh no! Oh no! There's gonna be some sort of romance, maybe. No. Uh-oh. I was surprised at what a nice smile he had. I had not noticed it before. My father rushed over to kiss me. He put an arm around my shoulder and led me to where his friend Don Cesar stood. "When do you deliver the cows and horses?" my father said. "How many did we wager?" Don Cesar asked, as if he didn't know and didn't care. 12 good riding horses, Don Saturnino said. 350 cattle. 300, Don Cesar corrected him. 300, but no boneyards. I wondered what use we would have for 300 cattle. We already had more than 7,000, and a cow was selling for only 50 centavos. But Don Cesar owned a herd of fine brood mares, and somehow I would try to get one or two. Perhaps we could trade some of the cattle, or all of them, for one good mare. Okay, now we know who won the race. Do we need to continue? Ooh, it's 8:30. We might need to read a couple more chapters just to make sure. That romance thing kind of made me worry a little bit, made me a little uneasy.